Hello. I want to use my opening remarks here to talk a little bit about a concept that I think needs to be more highlighted in the area of networks and specifically in the area of scientific networks. And that concept is network awareness. So just by way of outline, what I'm going to talk about is why the lack of network awareness can lead to failures in scientific networks and how technological and algorithmic affordances can make scientific networks more effective. So I want to start with the story of the introduction of the light cigarette. The light cigarette was introduced in the late 60s, early 70s, and the market share of light cigarettes grew from 2% in 67 to 83.5% of the tobacco market in 2005. During that period of time, the National Institutes of Health, in particular the National Cancer Institute, spent over $200 million in trying to examine what are the effects of light cigarettes. And there were three groups of studies that found three somewhat disparate findings. The epidemiologists found that tobacco-related cancer mortality spiked shortly after introduction of the light cigarette. Those who were doing reverse engineering cigarettes, because the tobacco industry was not disclosing the ingredients in light cigarette, they found that there were new additives in light cigarettes for which had unknown carcinogenic properties. And then finally, those who were studying smoking in smoking inhalation labs, where they wired up people and made them smoke cigarettes, found that people who smoke light cigarettes inhaled 5 times more smoke and smoked more cigarettes than people who smoked regular cigarettes. Unfortunately, these three areas of research remain siloed from each other within the National Cancer Institute. And it was only an individual scientist in San Francisco who happened to know about these three different areas of research, who then went to the National Cancer Institute in around 2000 and said, if you could give me a 6-month, $2 million grant to connect the dots, I think we might have a more definitive claim about the effect of light cigarettes. And sure enough, 6 months later, there was a study that finally concluded that the light brands don't help smokers. And in fact, they don't have any less carcinogenic impacts than regular cigarettes. So why did I start with the story? To me, the takeaway from this story is obviously about scientific networks. There were people within the scientific community all being funded by the National Cancer Institute that were not connected to each other. And so while it's true that the old adage helps explain part of it, it is not what you know, it's who you know. I think the key takeaway from this one was really, it's not just who you know, but who you think they know. So in other words, to what extent are you, it's not just about your network, but your awareness of your networks and who you think they knows. Now, in the area of social networks, David Krackhart had introduced the idea of cognitive social structures back in 1987, but it really has not been studied as much until recently in terms of the consequences that it can have for organizations. So I want you to consider the following scenario. You need to get a time-sensitive, a trustworthy piece of information either to or from a fellow scientist, call him Jacob, in response to a disease outbreak or a biological threat. You have to ask yourself, who among your direct contacts, in this case, Jim, Dorothy, or Sarah, can get that information to or from Jacob promptly, reliably, and efficiently? So what are your options? You could call or email Jacob, but since you don't know him personally, he may not reply promptly or not at all. You could go up and down the chain of command in the organization, but that could take a long time to reach Jacob and for you to get back a response. You could broadcast your request to everyone, but that would waste everyone's time reading your query, think spam. Or option 4, you could tap into your awareness of the network to guess who knows Jacob. And depending on how you want to do it, you have your own direct eyes, but you also have perceptions of who you think Jim knows. You may think Jim knows Dorothy, who knows Jacob. You may think that Sarah, who you know, knows Michael, and so on. And of course, in some of these cases, you might be perceiving them correctly, and in other cases, you may be perceiving them incorrectly. So what is the most efficient way to reach Jacob? You can do it inefficiently by sending the message to a person who then sends it to many other people before it gets to Jacob. Or if you know your network's awareness more accurately, you're able to get it to Dorothy, who can get it to Jacob almost immediately. So what predicts network awareness? Well, recent research is showing us that it is in fact predicted by individual characteristics, such as goal priority, which is the facet of psychological collectivism, which means that if I'm the kind of person who cares more about the goals of my group than about my own goals, then it turns out those are the people who have higher network awareness. It also turns out that network awareness is not a permanent feature, and that when people are under stress, your network awareness can actually fall. And then finally, and this is perhaps the good news, that network awareness can actually be learned, that as people become more aware of it and exercise this network muscle, if you may, that they are able to get better at being able to know who in their scientific network is connected to which other people, in which case they can avoid some of these biases. The other piece of good news is that in addition to us exercising our own network awareness muscle, we also have technologies and algorithms that can help us with network awareness. There's a long history of teams and how they're being helped with technologies, going back to groupware, intranet, social computing. But most recently and most promising is the recent advent of what is called as enterprise social media. This is just social media as we know it, but within the enterprise context. So these are examples of some of the platforms that we are using now in the workplace, including in the scientific workplace. The idea is that many of these new enterprise social media provide technological affordances in the workplace, and these technological affordances influence network awareness. For example, association. It allows us to reveal who knows who when we see chats happening in Slack or in Microsoft Teams. It allows us to understand and evaluate the knowledge as well as the links between people by seeing who's recommending what, who's commenting on what, who's liking or tagging what. It increases overall visibility by seeing how people have responded to questions raised. It increases persistence so that if you missed a certain interaction, you can go back and look at it later on. And of course, it increases personalization, which means you're able to understand a little bit more about each person based on how they want to present themselves on social media. In addition, it allows editability, that is the ability to revise information provided by others. It's pervasive. You can look at it in all kinds of devices. It increases just the general awareness of information, not just network awareness and updates from others. It makes it easier to search for information across search words, which also increases awareness. And then finally, allows you to create these groups to share information on the fly. In addition to this kinds of technological affordances, we also are beginning to see what I call algorithmic affordances that are increasing our network awareness. This is examples of two articles that we wrote recently about how recommender systems are algorithmically telling us more about our network and where we may want to reach people on the network. And so, for example, when you think about how affordances can help us assemble teams, in the past, we have been doing teams are being assembled by users, either being staffed by certain people or self-assembling. But today we are seeing more of the algorithmic formation of teams. And so here's an example of a recent study that we did that looks at the impact of algorithmic recommendation on teaming. We took into account controls that have been shown in prior research that shows that things like homophily and competence obviously is going to impact who we might choose in a team. We also know from prior research that we like to collaborate with those that we previously collaborated with. But if you look at the recommendation from technologies, we see that that also impacts and influences us in terms of deciding who to reach out on teams, especially those who we did not previously collaborate with or had familiarity with. So all of this to say that there is a lot of potential for our network awareness to help deal with some of the problems that the scientific community is dealing with, especially in response to issues of misinformation and biological threats. And so I conclude that the key takeaway from my opening remarks here is that there's an increased scientist awareness, that we need to increase scientist awareness about network awareness. Thanks much.